Did you really come to a public gathering to refer to 120 dead kids as collateral damage?
The collateral damage may be tragic, but the actual strike is completely legitimate.
Massacre implies intent. So what you're asking me to agree to is a statement that the people who dropped around in the context of 800 airstrikes intended to strike a school knowing it was a school. I can't agree with that. But
120 children, 1 elementary school, and 2 missiles. The second one timed for when the rescuers showed up. And when Mehdi Hasan put that in front of a former Pentagon director and a pro-war think tank fellow, neither of them would say the word massacre. One of them actually called it, and I want you to hear this, collateral damage. This is how Donald Trump's war on Iran got sold to you. But watch what happens when Mehdi Hasan finally refuses to let them hide behind that sort of language. Let's get into it.
So the action is the same.
You would agree that you cannot, quote, avenge Iranians by killing more Iranians. 1,700 civilians killed in this US-Israeli war, according to the most credible study. They've hit a dozen hospitals, 60 universities, 300 healthcare facilities, 760 schools. They blew up a civilian bridge. On the first day of this war, as you know, the United States carried out what is probably a war crime by massacring more than 120 kids in an elementary school.
Mm-hmm. So first off, again, we will not know for sure what is it. I lived through the period of in the Clinton administration where we had strikes on Iraq, which was also under sanctions. Those were reported as baby milk factories, and after the fact, we saw that that wasn't quite the same there. I think when we're dealing with an authoritarian regime that has control over the media and a policy of holding neutral journalists as hostages, like Jason Reslin, the reporter for the Washington Post.
But there's no debate about the school.
Well, the school we can talk about.
In fact, well, let's talk about the school. In the days following the attack on the school, you were on Twitter casting doubt that a US strike was responsible for blowing up a school full of children in Minab. A preliminary US internal military investigation confirms it was a US missile. Do you now acknowledge that you were wrong, that the US was responsible for this horrific massacre?
Hold on. So first off, massacre implies intent. So what you're asking me to agree to is a statement that the people who dropped around in the context of 800 airstrikes intended to strike a school knowing it was a school. I can't agree with that. But secondly, at the time, people were taking just the word of the regime. We didn't know what we knew then about missiles and swords.
So you accept you were wrong now?
I accept that I may be wrong. We do not know for sure.
You still don't know if you still think it might not be a US missile?
I think that it might, well, hold on. This is going to sound Jesuitical to you, but the word you used is massacre, which implies an element of intent. I think the worst case scenario.
You do realize that even without intent, something can still be a war crime if it's reckless.
Well, but there is a key definition in there, which is the level of care and the level of carelessness. In a country that is determined to commit war crimes, you would have, in the context of 800 airstrikes, you would have more than one school hit in the first night. Hold on.
Unfortunately, I've got more. On February the 28th.
Hold on.
No, you made a point. On February the 28th, the Pentagon used missiles untested in combat, according to New York Times, that bombed a sports hall used by a female volleyball team. They killed 21 people, including multiple children. That was also on the first day of the war. We just didn't know about it till weeks later because the United States government covered it up. It required the New York Times to use satellite imagery to find this out.
I am unfamiliar with that instance, but I will tell you that if your crack research team gets on it, you will see that there were instances where the besieged moved from their headquarters into sports halls as sheltering positions.
This sounds like a very Israeli argument here, that they brought it on themselves with human shields.
That's not what I'm saying.
In fact, here's what you did say, David. You said on Twitter,
yes,
Wikipedia says the Minab school is located 600 meters from the headquarters of the IRGC Navy Asif Brigade and used to be part of the base.
Yes.
Which sounds like you're justifying the massacre of kids by saying, well, the military base was nearby, so it's their fault. I would point out to you that U.S. Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, is very close to the Crossroads Elementary School.
Yeah.
If the Iranians or one of their proxies, God forbid, bombed Crossroads Elementary School and said, well, it was the U.S. Marine Corps' fault for building a base near the school, we would all condemn that. So would you, wouldn't you?
Well, first off, let's take a step back and assume that the United States deliberately wanted to kill children in a school.
That.
No,
but
let's just assume this. Let's just assume this, okay? Why would you assault a regional headquarters that has no influence on policy when you could kill the children of the regime leaders in Tehran? So clearly, it does not make sense if you assume the worst intent. But going forward, the size of the Quantico base or any other standard US versus the size of the Minab base are fundamentally different.
But all the evidence shows that it was very clear to anyone who bothered to check that this was a school, that it was separate from the base, and that's where the recklessness comes in.
Au contraire. Take a look at the aerial photographs of the base. The difference
Sky
between
News went to the base.
The difference.
New York Times looked at
yes.
the base.
So look at the photograph, and what you'll see is that there is a smaller base with a perimeter around it. The school was originally part of that base and was used for military
since
purpose.
2016, it was very clear on satellite imagery it was not part of the base. Let's stay on this subject, because it's an important subject, and let's bring in our panel. And I want to bring in Barak Seener, who's an associate research fellow at the national security think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. Barak, you also seem to have justified this massacre at the school by US airstrikes. I watched a speech you recently gave in London at a Iranian diaspora pro-war rally. You said, quote, "The location of the Revolutionary Guards base was the real war crime."
Yeah.
Just to be clear, I just did some checking before I came here, like I did with David. There is a Church of England primary school just minutes away from the Bramcote military barracks in Nuneaton. Is that a war crime by the British Ministry of Defence to put their base near a primary school?
In the context of a conflict, if somebody does their due diligence, they attempt to prevent civilian casualties, and their target is an IRGC base, then it is a legitimate target. The collateral damage may be tragic, but the actual strike is completely legitimate.
Did you really come to a public gathering to refer to 120 dead kids as collateral damage?
Look, that might be it might be, I said the word tragic as well, but that is what it is.
Collateral damage, 120 Iranian kids killed.
Of course, that is collateral damage. Collateral damage means the unintended consequences of a strike.
But you do realize, as I explained to David, it can still be a war crime.
I said in the very beginning that if you don't take your due diligence to attempt to take every measure to prevent civilian casualties, then it would be a war crime. I would assume that every attempt would have been taken to prevent that from happening.
So how do they end up killing 120 kids
Yes,
on what day?
I don't know why you would want to assume that that was the intent.
I never said a word about intent. I've been very clear. It's
No,
not about
no,
intent.
but
it's about reckless behavior.
But
if you use the word
recklessness is
massacre, you
intent.
do assume an intent.
That's,
if you use the word massacre, you do assume an intent.
That's not true at all.
Recklessness is intent.
I want to bring in Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini, who's a British-Iranian founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network. A lot of this war was sold as a way of freeing the people of Iran, as saving them after many of them were killed in January. And then we had this incident on day one. What did you make of it? And what do you make of what you've heard so far?
So first of all, I think what we know is that it was also a double tap incident. So let's say that they didn't know that it was a school. Let's assume that it was AI that told them that, you know, with old data that this was 10 years ago, was an IRGC base. Let's just give you that. But it was a double tap, meaning that they hit one missile, people came to save the kids, and then the second missile went in. So it is a massacre, it is a war crime. Whether it was intentional or not, let's hope it wasn't, although your missiles are very targeted from what we understand. And it was reckless. Now, the other thing that we don't talk about, and I think it's important in terms of whether civilians were deliberately targeted or not, is that 2/3 of the targets in Tehran, which is a city of 9 million, were civilian targets.
Let me bring in Mohammed Ali Shabani, who is a Middle East scholar, editor of the...
So I'm going to go ahead and pause that right there. But as usual, I'll leave a link in the description so you can check out the full exchange. So there's a few points for me. A former Pentagon director went on live TV and he couldn't bring himself to call 120 dead children in an elementary school a massacre, because massacre implies intent. That's the honesty, the moral universe of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's war machine, literally in one sentence. And we literally just heard the last lady actually inform us that it was a double tap hit. I didn't even know that. It was a double tap. So it definitely was a massacre, and there definitely was intent there, because it was a double tap hit. Now, the fact that it is that these guys are trying to play some kind of linguistic gymnastics, and they're trying to argue the meaning of imminent and massacre throughout that segment, but they won't argue with the New York Times satellite imagery that caught the US covering up a strike on a women's volleyball team for 2 weeks. And then you had Barak Seener flew to a London stage and called 120 dead Iranian kids collateral damage to Mehdi Hasan's face. I want you guys to remember that anytime these people try and lecture anyone about the lack of civility that it is that Iran shows, I want you guys to remember it, because the problem for me is this. So many times we are hearing stories that are put in a way to try and paint Iran in a negative way. And there's a lot of those stories and they can definitely be told. But unfortunately, now the world are starting to open their eyes to stories about the United States of America and Iran being spoken about in a negative light also. And this is what the problem is. This is honestly what the problem is. Now, I don't know about you guys, but for me, this is damning. And it doesn't matter what side it is that you're on. When it comes to children, you have to just accept the fact that, yes, it was a massacre. It was 120 kids being killed. That is not collateral damage. That is a war crime, and a price should be paid for it. Because this is the thing. Guess what? If Iran killed 120 Iranian kids, or God forbid, American kids, wow, we all know what the repercussions would be. Let me know your guys' thoughts down below.